Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the sleepy corners of ancient Greece. And yes, you probably won't survive this without at least a yawn or two. You're lying back on a soft hilltop, the kind where the grass tickles your arms and the sunlight pours down like melted gold. Somewhere nearby, a gentle breeze rustles olive leaves, and you can almost hear the faint echo of lyres strumming long before your time. Tonight we're taking the boring route, because nothing helps you drift off faster than a detailed stroll through the birth and early life of Apollo, that boy god who somehow balances being dazzlingly talented with catastrophically dramatic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go on. I'll wait while you post your location and local time in the comments. Alright, now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start by imagining Leto, a Titaness, wandering restlessly through sun-dappled hills. She's heavily pregnant, flitting from island to island, chased by the spiteful Hera, queen of the gods. You trudge alongside her in the mind's eye, feeling each soft step through time-scented grass, noting the trembling anticipation that comes with imminent divine labor. Leto's predicament wasn't just inconvenient. It was politically charged by Olympus's divine squabbles. Historians still argue whether the story symbolizes actual Greek island rivalries or just a theatrical metaphor for maternal struggle. By the time she finds the tiny sanctuary of Delos, you can almost sense the relief in her deep, slow breaths. That little island, a floating sliver of rock, becomes more than a refuge. It's a cradle for one of the most important figures in Greek mythology. You probably didn't realize that Delos was actually a sacred site even before Apollo's birth, a hub of maritime worship and pilgrimage, buzzing quietly with boats and traders who had no idea they were part of a narrative that would survive millennia. And then comes the birth. You're right there, feeling the warmth of the first golden rays sliding across tiny limbs. Leto gives birth to twins, Artemis, who emerges ready to run across the hills in a silver streak, and Apollo, the sun-kissed child whose cries seem to harmonize naturally with the chirping birds. Fringe scholars sometimes suggest that these twin myths encode ancient ideas about duality, light and moon, day and night, action and reflection, though it's anyone's guess how consciously the Greeks thought about it. You notice Apollo's golden hair, already catching sunlight like molten metal. Even newborn, there's a sense of inevitability, as if the boy is destined to strum, sing, and illuminate the world, literally and metaphorically. The morning smells of time, baked clay, and seawater mingle in your imagination as you watch Leto cradle her children, whispering incantations for protection. Apollo's first breath seemed to carry a promise, music, prophecy, and a fair bit of trouble. You, comfortably sprawled on your own pillow, can almost hear the gentle plinks of an invisible lyre tuning itself for the centuries ahead. Remember that feeling. This is the calm before the inevitable chaos that only a god like Apollo can stir. You notice how even in these earliest moments, the gods are human-like in their anxieties, pride, worry, and ambition all bundled up in golden swaddling cloth. It's reassuring, in a way, that even immortals have a bit of drama in their infancy. And as you sink deeper into the story, the sun seems to warm not just the hills, but your shoulders and the slow, unhurried rhythm of Greek myth itself. By now, you're absorbing small, factual threads, like the ancient festival rituals surrounding Delos' sanctity. Pilgrims would offer flowers, animal sacrifices, and sometimes even dance in circles, a real mix of spirituality and social spectacle. Historians still argue whether these rites were purely religious or also a subtle form of political networking. You notice a fringe detail. Some local myths hint that the island was thought to float freely, untethered to the ocean floor, which might explain why Apollo's birthplace is depicted as slightly magical. Imagine standing barefoot on that sandy, time-scented patch of earth, feeling the ocean mist cool your skin, knowing a god is breathing just steps away. You can almost hear Leto's soft voice and the distant crashing of waves, a lullaby and announcement all in one. And so, your journey into Apollo's life begins here, in the gentle cradle of Delos. You're aware that this is only the start. The boy god will soon leave the safe haven, striding into adventures that involve serpents, music, love, and very questionable decisions. But for now, you linger in this golden-hued tranquility, letting the delicate, almost imperceptible threads of myth settle into your imagination. There's a tactile quality to the story. The sand, the incense, the laughter and cries of newborn twins. That pulls you into the ancient world. And maybe, just maybe, it's boring enough to let your eyelids droop a little, in a perfectly God-approved way. After all, even Apollo had to start somewhere, and tonight, you're here with him. You trudge along the sun-drenched hills of Olympus' outskirts, imagining the intricate family drama that surrounds Apollo and Artemis. Their parents are a complicated mix: Leto, gentle but determined, and Zeus, charmingly reckless, hovering somewhere off-screen with a grin and a lightning bolt tucked behind his back. Hera, meanwhile, simmers with jealousy, and her disapproval stretches like a shadow across the twins' early years. You can practically feel the tension in the air, like a slow breeze, carrying distant thunder. Historians still argue whether these myths reflect actual Greek ideas about divine family hierarchies, or just convenient storytelling devices to explain human flaws. You notice that Greek myths are delightfully comfortable with messy parentage, kind of like a cosmic soap opera that never really ends, and Apollo's family is its most melodramatic cast. As you wander closer to the palace-like halls of Olympus, you hear snatches of conversation between the gods, a mix of flirtation, rivalry, and casual insults. Leto tries to keep her twins safe, but it's a tricky task with their father occasionally swooping in with half-baked advice and a habit of causing more problems than he solves. Imagine the toddlers, Artemis already darting about like a streak of moonlight, while Apollo sits a little straighter, head cocked, already attentive to patterns in clouds and sunlight. Even at this age, Apollo seems to absorb everything: the way birds soar, the glint of sunlight on a fountain, the subtle differences between lyres. Fringe scholars sometimes suggest that these early observations were an allegorical way to encode how Greeks thought children learned skills. Observation first, imitation second, divine inspiration occasionally thrown in. You lean down to peek at Apollo's curious eyes and can almost feel the weight of destiny pressing gently on his tiny shoulders. You move through palace corridors lined with frescoes depicting battles, feasts, and gods in the middle of awkward moments. Naked Zeus tripping over a cloak, Dionysus trying not to spill wine. Apollo's parents navigate these halls with all the grace of a cat walking on marble. Yet the twins are learning fast. Artemis is already whispering secrets to trees and small animals, while Apollo experiments with melodies that mimic bird calls. There's a faint scent of incense and honeysuckle, and it mingles with the polished stone floors, grounding you in this vivid, imagined reality. Historians still argue whether some of the family drama was based on political allegories, the struggles between Titans and Olympians, or simply moral storytelling for children. Though you notice the adults in Olympus seem just as capricious as any mortal. Then, of course, there are the occasional divine tantrums. Hera doesn't always get her way, and you imagine the twins dodging her wrath with the deftness of gymnasts. Sometimes you imagine Zeus leaning over and whispering clever advice, a flash of insight here, a cryptic warning there. Love, favoritism, resentment, and cleverness mingle in a divine stew, leaving Apollo to navigate both privilege and peril from the start. There's something quietly comforting about this. Maybe the gods are all complicated, but they're not inscrutable. You can almost relate to them. Fringe sources note that some early myths even imply that Hera's antagonism was an allegorical explanation for natural disasters that plagued Delos, storms, floods, and sudden disease. Imagine witnessing this, the wind picking up, waves crashing, and feeling the twins' fate as a pulse in the air. As you continue, you notice that the twins' personalities are already forming in contrast. Artemis embodies stealth, patience, and an almost silent power, while Apollo radiates curiosity, audacity, and that notorious godly confidence. Even their early pranks are telling. Apollo might hide someone's sandals or swap lyres, while Artemis orchestrates more subtle, almost poetic interventions, like leading Zeus's sacred stags on a merry chase through olive groves. These antics, seemingly trivial, already earn the twins' reputations and the gossip of Olympus is electric. Scholars still debate whether these tales were meant to teach morality, entertain, or subtly instill cultural norms about power and responsibility. And you, comfortably stretched out, notice the tiny rhythms of life around the twins, their laughter echoing off marble, their cries breaking the perfect stillness, the occasional hiss of Hera's disapproval drifting through the halls. Even as a passive observer, you can feel the slow shaping of character, the intricate weaving of relationships, and the simmering drama that will follow these children for decades. It's all gentle, warm, slightly chaotic, the perfect backdrop for a bedtime story meant to cradle your imagination as you drift deeper into mythic history. The twins' early lives are a careful dance between freedom and expectation, curiosity and caution, a pattern that will repeat itself endlessly in the larger stories to come. You find yourself tiptoeing along the corridors of Olympus again, though this time the scene is quieter, punctuated by giggles, whispers, and the occasional crash of porcelain that someone, not that it matters, was probably meant to be watching. Apollo, now barely more than a child, is testing his cunning, trying out small pranks that ripple through the palace like gentle tremors. He might swap Hephaestus's tools for twigs or redirect a servant's errands so that everyone ends up in the wrong hall at the wrong time. You can almost smell the faint perfume of disrupted incense, the scent mingling with warm stone and a touch of honey from the kitchens. Fringe sources suggest that such tales were early attempts to explain natural mischief, why animals disappear or objects go missing. But mostly, you just watch Apollo discovering cause and effect, delight and surprise in equal measure. Artemis, ever the vigilant twin, follows nearby, though with far less enthusiasm for outright mischief. She's already mastering stealth, flitting like a shadow across sun-dappled floors. You notice how differently they learn. She observes quietly, internalizing patterns, while Apollo experiments, sometimes with spectacular failure. Remember that golden lyre resting against a sunlit column from the first section? That instrument is already humming with tiny vibrations, responding to the boy's attempts at melody. Historians still argue whether these musical stories symbolize actual early Greek appreciation for learning through play, or if it's just a neat narrative device to show Apollo's inherent genius. You lean closer to imagine his tiny fingers tracing strings, his face scrunched in concentration, the first notes carrying a hint of divine resonance. One day, you watch him approach an unsuspecting servant carrying a tray of honey cakes. In his curiosity, Apollo tilts the tray ever so slightly, and the cakes slide down into a carefully orchestrated trap, a bucket of water resting just out of sight. The servant jumps, flustered but unharmed, while a giggle escapes the child god, light and melodic. You can feel the thrill, like a tiny electric current running through your spine, as you follow the cause and effect chain of events. Even minor accidents here are framed in storytelling to show lessons, cleverness, resourcefulness, and occasionally, humility. Some fringe scholars suggest that these tales might encode cultural lessons about community observation, or just good storytelling, probably both, because mythology rarely does just one thing. Then comes a slightly more elevated prank. Apollo, curious about mortal habits, decides to mimic a full-scale dinner banquet using miniature golden figurines of gods. Each figure performs a little action, sipping wine, gesturing an argument, or playing a tiny lyre. You, silently crouched nearby in your imagination, watch him carefully orchestrate interactions, realizing he's learning narrative structure, timing, and social observation all at once. Even gods appreciate storytelling, it seems, and Apollo is no exception. Historians still debate whether these stories are purely imaginative or reflect early Greek educational theories. Could a young child, even a divine one, truly learn strategy and social navigation through play? You shrug along with them in your head and let the scene settle gently into your imagination. Occasionally, Apollo's playful experiments go awry. A vase tips, a small flame singes a corner of a tapestry. Artemis raises an eyebrow but does not intervene. You feel a curious mixture of tension and amusement, like watching a toddler scale a bookshelf and wondering what will survive. You also notice subtle sensory details, the soft creak of floorboards, the sweet scent of honey, the cool air circulating through high windows. These little touches are exactly what lull a listener to sleep, while also keeping your imagination gently awake. Fringe sources note that early myths emphasize these domestic antics because they illustrate godly qualities in familiar terms, like patience, cleverness, and occasional exasperation, a reassurance that even divinity requires practice. And so, you trudge beside young Apollo as he tests boundaries and learns the first rules of influence and artistry. He experiments, he stumbles, and he laughs, carving small legends in the fabric of Olympus that will be remembered by mortals and gods alike. Even at this stage, you sense a rhythm to his life. Curiosity, play, consequence, reflection. The palace is alive. The twins are alive, and you, comfortably tucked in your bed or leaning into a soft cushion, are wrapped in this gentle swirl of historical imagination. These childhood antics, though small and seemingly mundane, set the foundation for everything that follows. The music, the mischief, and the inexorable rise of a god whose story will drift with you into dreamlike landscapes tonight. You follow Apollo down a sun-dappled glade, feeling the warmth on your shoulders and the gentle scratch of grass beneath your fingertips as he begins lessons in music from the muses themselves. Imagine the scene: 9 ethereal figures, each representing a different art form, leaning over a golden lyre that seems to pulse in time with your heartbeat. The air carries a soft hum, somewhere between bird song and a distant choir, as Apollo plucks at strings, fumbling at first, but gradually producing notes that shimmer like sunlight on water. Historians still argue whether these muses were ever actually conceived as separate entities in early Greek culture, or if later poets just divided inspiration into convenient categories. You notice the faint tang of incense, mingling with wildflowers, as if nature itself approves of the music taking shape. The lessons are not just formal, they are infused with gentle teasing, playful competition, and the occasional cheeky dig. One muse, with a sly grin, whispers a sharp critique that makes Apollo tilt his head, puzzled but attentive. Fringe sources suggest that some of these interactions may have originally been allegories for mentorship, demonstrating the tension between innate talent and disciplined learning. You imagine yourself sitting cross-legged on the grass, absorbing the soft laughter and the warm, golden sunlight filtering through olive branches, feeling the hum of creativity vibrating beneath your skin. Even in this seemingly simple learning, there's a palpable sense of magic. Apollo experiments with scales and rhythms, sometimes mimicking the calls of animals or the flow of water in a nearby stream. You can almost feel the subtle resonance in your bones as his tiny hands dance across the strings. There's a sensory richness here. The faint metallic shimmer of the lyre strings, the sweet smell of crushed herbs, and the occasional splash of water that adds a natural percussion. Historians still debate whether these musical stories were attempts to explain divine inspiration or simply charming narrative devices that teach listeners about observation and practice. Either way, you sense the emergence of a prodigy, a god whose skill is inseparable from curiosity. Then comes the more unusual, almost fringe teaching moment. One muse encourages Apollo to experiment with dissonance, producing sounds that make the nearby nymphs wrinkle their noses. He laughs at the effect, realizing that beauty in music can include tension, surprise, and even mild discomfort. You feel the thrill of discover yourself, that small shiver when you hear something unexpected but intriguing. Scholars sometimes speculate that this reflects early Greek ideas of aesthetic balance, the interplay between harmony and discord as a microcosm of life itself. You lean into the warmth of the imagined sun, letting the lesson settle gently around your shoulders like a soft blanket. Apollo's discipline is punctuated by moments of sheer exuberance. He leaps to play with rhythms inspired by the wind rustling through olive leaves or the pattern of his own heartbeat, experimenting, laughing, and learning simultaneously. You notice subtle textures, the soft scrape of fingers across strings, the faint aroma of crushed flowers underfoot, the glint of sunlight bouncing off golden instruments. Even as a passive observer, you feel the energy and rhythm of this divine pedagogy, which seems both timeless and utterly immediate. Fringe texts suggest that the stories of these lessons might encode symbolic ideas about the mind's receptivity to beauty and order, though, as always, The debate rumbles quietly beneath the surface. Finally, you sense the slow weaving of personality into skill. Apollo is no longer just a curious child. He is absorbing temperament, patience, and the playful audacity that will define him. The lessons from the Muses extend beyond music. They teach observation, subtlety, and the value of experimentation. You, lying back with the soft hum of a fan or the gentle evening breeze brushing your skin, feel the story's rhythm matching your own heartbeat, your own breath. Even in the calm of these glades, the threads of Apollo's myth are stitching themselves into an intricate tapestry. Talent, curiosity, mischief, and the whisper of future greatness all coiling together, ready to spill into the world beyond. You trudge alongside Leto once more, this time entering the delicate rituals surrounding Delos itself. The island, though small and seemingly unremarkable, vibrates with sacred energy. You feel the crunch of tiny stones beneath your sandals and the subtle salt tang of the sea breeze, carrying with it incense, smoke from ceremonial fires. Pilgrims gather quietly, their feet brushing soft sand, offering flowers, lambs, and sometimes coins in shallow bowls. Even as an observer, you can sense the weight of reverence. Delos is more than a birthplace. It is a locus of divine attention, a place where mortals and gods converge in a carefully choreographed dance. Historians still argue whether these rituals were formalized in response to real geopolitical importance or purely mythic imagination, but either way, the island hums with the aura of significance. The purification rites themselves are slow, deliberate, and filled with sensory detail. You watch priests and priestesses dip their hands in spring-fed water, sprinkle petals, and chant softly, their voices weaving a gentle, hypnotic rhythm. Leto's role is central. She is both mother and sacred intermediary, guiding offerings with careful attention. French sources suggest that the rituals may encode early ideas about liminality, birth as a bridge between chaos and order, mortality and divinity, but no one can quite agree. You notice the faint aroma of thyme and rosemary, mingling with smoke, creating a scent that is both grounding and ethereal, perfect for carrying a listener towards sleep. As the rites continue, Apollo is barely more than a toddler, yet even now he participates in subtle ways, absorbing patterns of sound and motion. You see him clapping softly in rhythm, tilting his head to the tonal shifts of chants, and occasionally mimicking gestures with his small hands. It's almost hypnotic, watching the youngest god internalize the ceremonial flow, his attention both playful and intense. Historians still debate whether these details were meant to illustrate actual child-rearing practices in sacred contexts or simply to highlight Apollo's early, innate divinity. You, leaning into the imagined warmth of the morning sun, feel the slow, deliberate pacing of ritual, each movement, each note, each offering designed to connect heaven and earth. The ceremonies often include subtle elements of theatricality. A procession winds slowly along the coastline, torches flickering, robes brushing wet sand, lyres strumming gentle accompaniment. You notice how the visual, auditory, and olfactory elements are designed to reinforce the sacred narrative. Apollo's birth is celebrated not merely as a historical moment, but as an ongoing, living event, continuously acknowledged by human and divine participants. French scholars have suggested that this layered sensory experience mirrors early Greek pedagogical ideas, learning through repetition, observation, and immersion in multisensory environments. You inhale the imagined combination of sea, incense, and flower petals, feeling the slow pull of ritual energy settle into your mind, like a lullaby in motion. And then there's the debate over Delos' exact location. Some texts describe it as a floating island, untethered to the sea floor, while archaeological evidence paints a slightly more mundane picture of a rocky, inhabited site. You picture both possibilities, a magically adrift sanctuary, and a sturdy, weather-beaten island buzzing with pilgrims. Either way, the island functions as a liminal space. Birth, divine attention, and early education for Apollo converge here, wrapped in layers of history, mythology, and a dash of poetic exaggeration. You lean back, feeling the imaginary sun warming your shoulders and the faint ocean mist brushing your cheeks, and the story moves gently onward. Delos, with all its incense, rituals, and tiny rhythmic heartbeats, has become the stage upon which Apollo's early divinity is both celebrated and cemented. The air carries the soft resonance of music as the rituals close. Small birds twitter in the olive trees, and you notice that Apollo, even now, is drawn to sound. He tilts his head toward the gentle clash of offerings, the soft splash of ritual water, and perhaps even the quiet whisper of a breeze across stones. You, comfortably settled in your own bed or cushioned nook, feel the calm enveloping you. The story, slow and deliberate, mirrors the pacing of the rites themselves, careful, intentional, and laced with sensory richness. The island, the mother, the tiny god, they all linger in your imagination, grounding you in a world where the sacred and the ordinary intermingle, just enough to coax your eyelids heavier with each passing moment. You trudge toward a damp, shadowy cave tucked into the rocky cliffs of Delphi, the air thick with earth and the faint tang of moss. This is no ordinary cave. It's the lair of Python, the serpent Apollo will confront in his early adolescence. You can feel the chill seep through your imaginary clothes, the slick stone under your fingers, and hear the faint drip of water echoing like tiny drums in the vast hollow. Fringe scholars suggest that Python may symbolize the untamed forces of nature or old chthonic deities, but historians still argue whether the myth actually reflects pre-Greek religious practices or is simply a narrative invention to highlight Apollo's heroism. Either way, you're tense, yet strangely soothed, as you step closer to the legend in your mind. Apollo, still slim and lithe, approaches with a mix of confidence and curiosity. You notice the way he balances himself, the golden sunlight reflecting off his hair, the subtle tightening of his hands around his first bow and arrows, the serpent coils, scales glinting like wet stones, eyes glimmering with a predatory intelligence. You shiver slightly, not because it's terrifying in a realistic sense, but because the story insists on tension, the kind that makes you subconsciously clutch your blanket. Fringe sources note that Python's depiction may also encode natural hazards, snakes, disease, and chaos lurking in untamed spaces, but the myth transforms fear into ritualized confrontation, a theme that resonates with early Greek ideas about order and heroism. You notice the subtle sensory layers, the scent of damp stone mingling with crushed herbs nearby, the faint hiss of wind through cave openings, and the slick feeling of water pooling in shallow indentations. Apollo's first movements are tentative, almost experimental. He probes, observes, and reacts. You can almost feel the deliberate calculation as he gauges the serpent's reach, speed, and temperament. Historians still argue whether these details were originally part of oral storytelling or were later embellishments added by poets to dramatize heroism. The tension is balanced by Apollo's small quirks. He hums lightly under his breath, testing his voice's resonance against the echoing walls, a tiny signature of personality amid the looming danger. The confrontation escalates gradually. You see Apollo nimbly dodging the serpent's quick strikes, sliding across slick stones, his arrows tracing golden arcs in the half-light. It's a delicate dance between skill and instinct. Fringe interpretations suggest that Python might represent chaos in human life, and that Apollo's victory symbolizes the imposition of order through intellect and precision rather than brute force. You notice the subtle contrast between fear and control, the way Apollo's breathing syncs with your own imagined heartbeat, the tension weaving into the rhythm of your mind as you trace every flick of scale and arrow tip. Finally, after what seems like a long, suspenseful sequence, Apollo triumphs, not with rage, but with skill, timing, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the serpent's movements. You feel the imagined relief in your shoulders, the tiny exhalation escaping your own lips, and the sense that even the most intimidating challenges can be met with patience, observation, and quiet courage. Fringe texts sometimes hint that this early victory may also symbolize the assertion of new religious or cultural order over older traditions, a motif that scholars love to debate, but rarely resolve. You, cushioned and warm, lean into the soft imagery of sun breaking through clouds, golden light spilling across wet stones, the serpent's retreat, and Apollo standing tall, small, yes, but already monumental in the rhythm of myth. The cave falls silent, except for the soft drip of water and the whisper of the breeze. You notice how even in victory, there's no triumphal fanfare, just a gentle settling of tension and the quiet reinforcement of skill over impulse. This is the first major test in Apollo's story, and it sets a pattern. Challenges approached with calm observation, mastery emerging from practice, and a subtle acknowledgement that even gods are subject to learning curves. As you sink deeper into the story, the shadows of the cave, the chill of stone, and the triumphant yet measured exhalation of Apollo wrap around you, weaving a hypnotic lullaby that bridges the ancient and the immediate, the mythic and your slowly drooping eyelids. You trudge upward now, toward the craggy heights of Delphi, feeling the wind tug at your hair and brush your cheeks with a faint salt tang, as if the mountain itself exhales. This is the place where Apollo will establish the famed oracle at Delphi, a site that will dominate Greek thought, politics, and imagination for centuries. You hear the murmuring of priests, the rustle of flowing robes, and the faint, rhythmic inhalation of the Pythia herself, seated atop her tripod, swaying ever so slightly as the intoxicating vapors curl around her. Fringe scholars sometimes suggest that the intoxicating gases themselves, perhaps ethylene or methane, played a role in inducing prophetic trance, though historians still argue whether the Pythia's visions were literally inspired or carefully crafted performances designed to guide human behavior. You notice the sensory richness immediately, the sweet, resinous aroma of burning pine, the dry scrape of sand beneath sandal-clad feet, and the low echo of voices harmonizing with the mountain's natural acoustics. The temple's architecture is both imposing and intimate, a mix of massive stone columns and small, quiet alcoves, as though the mountain itself conspires to make every whisper carry weight. You imagine yourself perched on a cool marble step, toes brushing warm stone, heart quietly racing as the first trembling words of prophecy float into the cavernous hall. Apollo's presence is subtle but undeniable, the warmth of sun on your shoulders, the faint vibration in the air from unseen lyres, the sense that the god is watching, guiding, orchestrating the slow rhythm of fate. As the Pythia begins to speak, her voice a soft, undulating chant, you sense how the prophetic words are carefully interpreted by priests, shaped into statements that will influence kings, generals, and ordinary mortals alike. Fringe interpretations suggest that the oracle may have functioned as a controlled social tool, a way to mediate conflict and legitimize authority, though historians still debate whether the divine element was central or a narrative embellishment added later. You notice the subtle interplay between chaos and order. The Pythia's trance seems spontaneous, yet the entire ritual is highly structured, balancing danger and guidance, the unpredictable and the codified. You also become aware of the festival rhythms surrounding Delphi. Pilgrims bring offerings of bronze, silver, and sometimes intricate figurines, carrying scents of burning incense and crushed herbs that mingle with the cool mountain air. The sound of flutes and lyres drifts from distant alcoves, harmonizing with the whisper of wind through olive branches. You notice Apollo's early influence. Even if he is not physically present, his essence seems embedded in every gesture, every chant, every carefully arranged stone. Scholars still argue whether the myths of Delphi's origin were retrofitted to match Apollo's arrival or if the god's connection developed organically from older local cults. You inhale deeply, letting the mountain air mingle with imagined incense, feeling a gentle hum of divinity settle into your bones. There are small, human touches amid the divine, a child placing flowers at the altar, a priest laughing quietly at a minor error, the clink of coins dropped into a sacred offering box. You notice the textures, the warmth of sun on polished stone, the faint tremor of excitement among pilgrims awaiting their fortunes. Even the tiniest details, the flicker of candlelight, the ripple of mist along carved steps, the shimmer of sun on ceremonial bowls, seem carefully orchestrated to heighten the sense of the sacred. Fringe sources hint that these micro-details were as crucial to the experience as the oracular pronouncements themselves, making Delphi both a physical and psychological space of heightened awareness. As you settle into the imagined scene, you feel the mountain's rhythm slow your breathing, the murmur of prophecy weaving a subtle lull into your mind. Apollo's shadow lingers, not in obvious form, but in the cadence of rituals, the attentive eyes of priests, and the faint resonance of unseen lyres. Even here, in the silent observation of history, the god asserts influence, showing that divinity is as much about subtlety as spectacle. You sink into this interplay of human and divine, mountain and mist, anticipation and calm, allowing the story of Apollo at Delphi to drift over you like a soft, unhurried melody, each note designed to guide your imagination gently toward rest. You trudge through sunlit forests now, the smell of pine resin and wildflowers thick in your imagination, following Apollo as he takes up the bow. Arrows are slung across his back, their fletching catching the light like tiny sparks, and you notice how the god moves with effortless grace, each step purposeful, each glance measured. The thrill of archery isn't just in hitting a target, it's in anticipation, in the subtle tension of string and bow, the quiet hum of wind, and the whisper of leaves as they tremble in passing. Fringe scholars suggest these myths encode early Greek appreciation for skill mastery and spatial awareness, while historians still argue whether Apollo's archery tales are metaphorical representations of divine intervention or just fantastical narrative flourishes designed to inspire awe. Apollo's adventures in archery are not merely solitary exercises. Sometimes they are contests, sometimes demonstrations, sometimes training sessions for mortals lucky enough to observe. You imagine standing behind a mossy tree, holding your breath, watching a golden arrow fly in a perfect arc, barely missing a squirrel, or perhaps intentionally missing for amusement. The air is thick with anticipation, a subtle electric charge running through your imaginary fingertips as you follow each movement. Some fringe interpretations suggest that Apollo's archery represents not only precision, but also moral judgment, the god striking at misdeeds or errant behavior symbolically rather than literally. You notice how even small actions carry weight, a reminder that skill in myth is entwined with responsibility. You follow him deeper into the forest as he encounters various beasts and challenges. There's a deer frozen mid-step, a fox darting between trees, and the occasional mischievous nymph hiding behind ivy. You can almost feel the texture of bark under your palms, the softness of moss beneath your shoes, the whisper of arrow feathers against each other as Apollo readies another shot. Historians still argue whether these encounters are symbolic lessons in mastery over nature or simply narrative embellishments meant to thrill listeners. Fringe sources even suggest that some archery episodes were originally agricultural metaphors, a way to illustrate precise timing in sowing and harvesting, though the evidence is slippery, much like the path underfoot. Occasionally, Apollo intentionally misses. You watch as a golden arrow sails harmlessly past a tree, disrupting a bird's flight path just enough to provoke a startled flutter, and you can't help but feel a twinge of amusement. Even gods, it seems, appreciate subtle humor, the tiny unpredictabilities that keep life engaging. You notice how the sunlight flickers through the branches, catching the curve of a bowstring, glinting off golden hair, and casting shadows that sway like living lace. Fringe scholars note that such details might serve as allegorical teaching. Precision is vital, but restraint and awareness of surroundings matter just as much. You feel a gentle thrill as you imagine yourself sharing the forest floor with him, heart sinking to the rhythm of bowstring and breeze. By the time Apollo reaches a clearing, his form is perfectly poised, arrows fanning in a golden spread, his expression a balance of focus and delight. He shoots not just for targets, but for the subtle shaping of the world around him, nudging animals, redirecting winds, harmonizing natural rhythms with divine skill. Historians still argue whether these stories were intended as moral exemplars, entertainment, or a combination of both, but you can sense their hypnotic effect, gently lulling you into the slow cadence of myth. You inhale the imagined scents, pine earth, crushed herbs, and the soft rhythm of forest life fills your mind, every twang of bowstring echoing in time with your own heartbeat. And as the sun begins to dip behind the distant peaks, casting long shadows across leaf-strewn paths, you feel a gentle sense of accomplishment alongside the young god. Apollo's archery, like music, like mischief, is a blend of precision, patience, and playful unpredictability. You sink back into your pillow or cushion, letting the story's measured rhythm sync with your breathing. The forest grows quieter, only the faint rustle of leaves and the soft hum of distant wildlife accompanying your journey, as the young god moves through skill, challenge, and gentle triumph, leaving you wrapped in an almost tangible sense of calm anticipation. You trudge along sun-warmed paths now, the faint scent of wild thyme drifting from the edges of your imagination, as Apollo begins to navigate the confusing, tangled world of love. Imagine the warmth of spring in your cheeks, the soft rustle of olive branches, and a breeze that carries both pollen and unspoken desire. Apollo, god of light and music, discovers that charm and skill don't always guarantee affection. He chases mortals, nymphs, and occasionally fellow immortals, feeling the twinge of unrequited longing each time his golden gaze fails to elicit the desired response. Fringe scholars suggest that these myths encode early Greek reflections on desire, power, and social hierarchy, while historians still argue whether these stories were meant primarily as moral lessons, entertainment, or both. One afternoon, you watch Apollo attempt to woo a mortal maiden. His approach is careful, almost ceremonial, bow slung across his back, golden lyre tucked under one arm. The air is filled with birdsong, the distant chatter of a flowing stream, and the gentle clatter of leaves underfoot. Apollo tries melodies meant to charm, his voice rising and falling in a pattern designed to seduce. But the maiden, with a laugh, dodges and spins away, unperturbed. You notice the subtle humor. Even a god with unmatched beauty and talent cannot bend human will completely. Fringe sources suggest that this tale, like many romantic misadventures, was originally a cautionary story highlighting respect, consent, and the boundaries between mortals and the divine. Apollo's pursuits are varied. Sometimes they succeed briefly. A nymph catches a note from his lyre and pauses, intrigued. Other times, he miscalculates entirely, tripping over roots, or spooking a flock of birds meant to be a living orchestra. You can almost feel the softness of the forest floor beneath your palms, hear the flutter of wings, and smell crushed herbs where Apollo's foot presses. Historians still argue whether these tales were meant to glorify love as an aspirational pursuit or satirize the folly of desire. But either way, the story draws you into the delicate tension between charm and consequence. Then comes the occasional lesson in humility. Apollo might aim a song at one who seems receptive, only to have it echoed back in a mocking refrain or redirected entirely. You notice the sensation in your chest, a sympathetic pulse of awkward anticipation, almost like watching someone's first crush play out in slow motion. Fringe interpretations propose that such stories emphasize the importance of emotional intelligence, patience, and resilience, even for a god. You inhale the imagined scents, the sweet of wildflowers, the tang of river water, and feel the subtle rise and fall of hope, rejection, and gentle disappointment, each beat resonating with your own memory of early flirtations, awkward encounters, and the slow accumulation of wisdom. Despite these minor failures, Apollo's pursuit is never dull. Each encounter teaches him, sharpens his understanding of emotion, and refines his approach, not to manipulate, but to harmonize. You watch him notice the curve of a smile, the tilt of a head, the faint flush of skin, absorbing details that ordinary mortals might miss. Scholars still debate whether these love tales were designed to instruct, amuse, or elevate Apollo's character as both relatable and exceptional. You, comfortably settled into your cushion or pillow, feel the narrative's rhythm slow around your body, the warm sun, the soft earth, and the gentle amusement coiling around your mind. Here, in the interplay of affection, rejection, and curiosity, the god's human side emerges, tenderly imperfect and quietly instructive, a lullaby of longing, anticipation, and the sweet ache of desire, weaving its calm magic through your imagination. You trudge through the whispering wind now, the faint scent of thyme and pine thick in your imagination, as the story turns toward Cassandra, the tragic mortal seer. Picture her in a dimly lit chamber, eyes wide with knowledge that no one will believe, her hands trembling as she gestures toward looming disasters. Apollo, infatuated, promises her insight and prophetic ability in exchange for her affection, and for a moment, you can almost feel the pulse of desire and anticipation vibrating through the room. Fringe scholars sometimes suggest that this story encodes early Greek cautionary tales about power, knowledge, and consent. While historians still argue whether the myth originated to explain the futility of foresight or the dangers of divine human entanglement. Cassandra's curse is subtle but devastating. She can see the truth of the future, yet no mortal will heed her warnings. You feel the weight of this tension, as though a heavy, invisible hand presses on your chest, slowing your breathing in sympathy. The air is tinged with crushed herbs and candle smoke, a sensory combination that underscores both the sacred and the ominous. Fringe interpretations note that this may symbolize the broader human condition, knowing what is right or true, yet lacking the power to effect change. You, leaning into the imagined dim light, sense a quiet sorrow that doesn't scream but lingers, gently tugging at your empathy. Apollo, meanwhile, is a mix of charm and frustration. He flits about, trying to impress, to cajole, to negotiate with words and gestures imbued with golden grace. You notice the small, almost humanistic touches, a sigh, a tilt of the head, the flicker of impatience in his gaze. Historians still argue whether his behavior reflects a broader Greek understanding of hubris and divine entitlement or if it is merely a narrative convenience to explain Cassandra's plight. The room itself is alive with tension, the flicker of torchlight casting dancing shadows, the distant murmur of a mountain breeze through open windows, and the subtle creak of floorboards beneath imagined footsteps. Cassandra's visions ripple through the air like invisible currents. You sense the tragic pattern, wars looming, betrayals unfolding, cities on the brink, yet no one listens. Fringe scholars sometimes suggest that her curse functions as a narrative tool to highlight the limits of divine power and human perception simultaneously. You notice how even the faintest movements, her hands tracing prophetic symbols, the quiver in her voice, convey urgency and despair, leaving you with a subtle ache in your chest. It's the kind of tension that makes you lean slightly forward, imagining the scene fully, yet also settling deeper into your cushion, lulled by the hypnotic cadence of storytelling. Despite her tragedy, there's a quiet dignity to Cassandra. You trudge alongside her awareness, feeling her persistence, her intelligence, and her unwillingness to surrender entirely, even as the world ignores her. Apollo's presence lingers, not as a savior, not entirely, but as a catalyst, highlighting the limits of desire, power, and divine influence. Historians still argue whether Cassandra represents the inevitability of fate or the frustration of knowledge unmet with action, but you can feel the story's hypnotic rhythm weaving through your own mind. The dim torchlight, the soft rustle of her robes, and the gentle sigh of wind combine to craft a scene that is haunting, quiet, and mesmerizing. A story that lingers just long enough to soften your thoughts, coaxing your eyelids heavier, carrying you further into myth's embrace. You trudge along the sun-dappled hills once more, feeling the soft brush of time and wildflowers underfoot, as Apollo's story shifts toward his role as a god of prophecy. Imagine the air thick with anticipation, a faint electric charge humming invisibly, the distant murmur of wind through olive groves echoing like a chorus. Apollo's focus sharpens. He traces the arc of the future with gestures that are both deliberate and fluid, drawing invisible lines that link past, present, and potential. Fringe scholars suggest these prophetic myths may encode early Greek experimentation with divination practices, while historians still argue whether Apollo's omniscience was a narrative convenience or a reflection of societal fascination with fate and foreknowledge. You notice the sensory details immediately. The glint of sunlight on his golden hair, the soft rustle of his robes, the warm weight of sand beneath your imagined feet. Apollo listens to patterns in nature, the ripple of water, the flight of birds, the sway of trees, and interprets them as messages. Fringe interpretations suggest that this reflects a sophisticated observational method hidden within myth. Early Greeks may have relied on careful attention to natural phenomena to predict weather, crop yields, and social events. You, curled into your pillow, can almost feel the rhythm of his breath matching the pulse of the earth, a quiet synchronization that whispers of hidden patterns and delicate insight. As you trudge closer, you notice the Pythia seated within her sacred tripod, the ethereal mist curling around her like a veil. Apollo's guidance is subtle. He does not speak, but his presence clarifies, sharpens, and channels the flow of insight. Historians still debate whether the myths of the Pythia were literal divine inspiration or a carefully staged ritual, though the imagery of the god hovering, influencing, and observing remains potent. The smell of incense, damp stone, and crushed herbs combines with the faint echo of distant lyres, creating a multi-sensory tableau that lulls you into a slow, steady awareness of both danger and serenity. You watch a priest bring forward an offering, a bronze statuette, carefully polished, its weight warm in the hand. Apollo's golden gaze follows the gesture, and you feel the subtle pull of energy in the scene, the sacred and mundane intertwined. Fringe sources suggest that these small acts, amplified by the god's attention, served as microlessons in ritual attentiveness and moral alignment, subtly reinforcing societal norms. You notice the gentle tension in the Pythia's body, the faint shiver of anticipation in every movement, the rhythm of breath and expectation echoing across stone floors. Even the smallest details, the sway of a robe, the glint of a coin, the faint vibration of footsteps, contribute to a hypnotic narrative cadence. By the time the vision emerges, words fall slowly, with measured cadence, each syllable pregnant with significance. You can almost sense the deliberate weaving of future events, the careful balance of warning and guidance. Apollo's role is not of overt interference, but of calibrated insight, a quiet shaping of awareness that respects the freedom of mortals while nudging the world toward alignment. Historians still argue whether Apollo's prophetic interventions were symbolic metaphors for rational foresight or literal divine instruction, yet you feel the story's slow rhythm in your own chest, a gentle lull echoing in time with imagined exhalations and the serene rise and fall of breath. The world of myth, for now, is quiet, focused, and infinitely hypnotic, and you are safe within its golden-hued rhythms. You trudge along the sun-baked plains now, feeling the heat seep into your shoulders as Apollo turns his attention to healing, a domain that blends divine skill, observation, and subtle showmanship. Picture him kneeling beside a struggling villager, hands glowing faintly with golden light as he murmurs gentle incantations. The air is warm, carrying the scent of dry grass, crushed herbs, and a distant hint of incense from nearby shrines. Fringe scholars sometimes suggest these healing stories were originally practical allegories for early medical practices, while historians still argue whether they were intended to elevate Apollo's divinity or simply to teach moral lessons about care and responsibility. You notice the tactile detail, the soft brush of a hand against sun-warmed skin, the slight hiss of heat off a shallow river, and the quiet exhale of relief from someone who feels tension leaving their muscles. Apollo applies not just magical intervention but attentive observation, adjusting gestures, murmuring softly, and even offering tiny, human-like reassurances. Some fringe interpretations suggest these stories encode early Greek appreciation for empirical observation, the ability to diagnose, notice patterns, and respond thoughtfully. You, lying comfortably with a pillow pressed to your back, feel a subtle rhythm form, a slow inhale and exhale that mirrors the gentle ebb of healing energy. The process is not instantaneous. Apollo's methods blend patience and precision. You watch him use herbs, water, and light, sometimes testing minor remedies, sometimes improvising with sudden inspiration. Historians still debate whether the myth's emphasis on healing reflects a deeper cultural understanding of health, a divine endorsement of certain practices, or simply a narrative device to display the god's versatility. You notice the faint shimmer of golden sunlight on the healer's hair, the tiny quiver of his brow as he concentrates, the quiet sounds of the surrounding fields, all sensory details that pull you deeper into the scene. Sometimes, Apollo's healing is accompanied by gentle music. A lyre strums softly nearby, birds harmonize in the trees, and even the faint rustle of a breeze seems synchronized with his hands. Fringe sources suggest that these musical elements symbolize the therapeutic resonance of sound in early Greek thought, though historians still debate whether it was an actual cultural practice or poetic embellishment. You can almost feel the vibrations in your chest, the subtle harmonics brushing against your awareness, reinforcing both skill and the serene rhythm of myth unfolding slowly around you. As the sun dips lower, the narrative softens. Villagers walk away feeling lighter, a quiet blessing lingering in the air. And you, too, sense the gentle shift. The combination of observation, precision, and divine presence establishes a pattern. Apollo's influence is both practical and symbolic, teaching lessons through demonstration rather than force. You notice the textures, the soft grass, the warm stone, the cool river touch, and the story's rhythm slows your heartbeat, wrapping you in calm observation, patience, and quiet satisfaction. Even the smallest details, a faint breeze, a whispered laugh, a glint of golden light, draw you deeper, creating a soothing cadence as you continue drifting through the gentle, hypnotic world of myth, guided by the subtle power of a god whose touch is both miraculous and tenderly human. You trudge across sun-warmed plains again, feeling the dry grass crunch softly beneath your feet, as Apollo's tale turns to his musical contests with the satyr Marsyas. Picture the scene: a sunlit clearing, olive trees casting long shadows, and the air buzzing faintly with anticipation, like electricity before a summer storm. Marsyas, a master of the aulos, flares with competitive pride, while Apollo adjusts the strings of his golden lyre with quiet, deliberate precision. Fringe scholars suggest that this myth may reflect early Greek ideas about cultural tension between artistic traditions, while historians still argue whether the story is primarily a morality tale about hubris or a reflection of actual musical contests. The duel begins subtly. You hear the faint scrape of Marsyas' reed, the soft vibration of Apollo's strings, and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. You can almost feel the air thrum with anticipation, the way a room seems to hold its breath during a delicate performance. Apollo starts with simple melodies, each note precise, deliberate, and measured. Fringe interpretations suggest that the myth encodes broader lessons about refinement versus raw talent, while historians debate whether the story originally symbolized social hierarchies in artistic education or was simply an entertaining narrative. You lean closer, imagining the faint metallic tang of polished strings and the warm sun on your arms, sensing the quiet drama of competition. As the contest escalates, Apollo's skill becomes apparent. Every note resonates, bending subtly with expression and clarity. Marsyas counters with rapid, intricate flourishes, his pride fueling his performance. You notice how the narrative emphasizes not just technical ability, but also temperament. Apollo's calm, measured confidence contrasts sharply with Marsyas' impulsive energy. Fringe sources suggest that the story might also reflect ethical concerns. Skill should be tempered with humility, ambition balanced with restraint. Historians still argue whether this duel represents a cautionary tale about mortal audacity in the face of divine authority or a broader allegory for the discipline required in mastering any art form. Then comes the famous twist. Apollo suggests they play upside down, an impossible challenge for a mortal with a reed instrument. You feel the tension coil in your chest as the story unfolds, the quiet anticipation, the sudden shift, the cleverness of the god. You notice the sensory details, the warmth of the sun, the faint smell of crushed herbs, the soft scrape of Marsyas' hooves against stone, and the subtle gleam of sweat on his furred skin. Fringe interpretations often note that these elements serve to heighten the dramatic tension, making the lesson about skill, innovation, and overconfidence all the more vivid. You feel a small thrill at the narrative's cleverness, even as it unfolds gently enough to lull you towards sleep. By the contest's conclusion, the moral is clear. Apollo's mastery, intelligence, and patience outstrip raw talent and impulsive pride. Marsyas is humbled, and though the myth later darkens with punishment, you notice that the story in this telling is tempered, focusing on growth, discipline, and the consequences of overreaching. Historians still argue whether the darker elements were later embellishments to instill fear or moral compliance, but the story's rhythm remains hypnotic, slow, deliberate, rich in sound, sight, and subtle tension. You sink deeper into your cushion or pillow, feeling the sun on your imagined skin, the hum of wind in the trees, and the echo of golden strings vibrating through your chest, a soft lullaby weaving through myth, music, and moral reflection. You trudge along rocky hillsides now, the faint scent of laurel leaves and dry stone filling your imagination, as Apollo begins his role as a bringer of plague and protector, a duality that fascinates mortals and gods alike. Picture him stepping lightly among soldiers and villagers, the warmth of sun on his skin contrasting with the chill of the shadows he casts. His bow is always at the ready, but the tension in his stance is subtle. He is neither careless nor malevolent, merely asserting cosmic balance. Fringe scholars suggest that these myths encode early Greek concepts of causality and divine justice, while historians still argue whether Apollo's dual role is metaphorical for the unpredictability of nature or intended as a literal divine warning. You notice the sensory textures, the metallic scent of blood mixed with crushed earth, and the faint smoke from small ceremonial fires. Villagers whisper prayers, some trembling, some confident, depending on their perception of the god's favor. Apollo moves silently, almost like a shadow, his golden hair catching fleeting sunlight, his eyes surveying each movement with quiet precision. Fringe interpretations often suggest that this duality teaches lessons about responsibility. With power comes both the capacity to protect and to harm, and balance is required. Historians still debate whether ancient audiences internalized these lessons as moral instruction or as entertainment. The story often highlights subtle interactions rather than dramatic violence. You watch Apollo gently lift a sick child from a straw mat, touch glowing hands to a fevered brow, and whisper softly, sending warmth and healing into the body. Moments later, his arrows, aimed with divine precision, strike distant foes, bringing swift consequences for offenses against sacred order. You can almost feel the energy in the air, warmth, tension, and the faint vibration of anticipation. The myth balances mercy and retribution, reminding mortals that the same hand can nurture and chastise, and that attentiveness to divine signals is both prudent and necessary. You also sense the psychological dimension. Villagers interpret events in ways that reinforce social cohesion and respect for ritual. The faint clink of coins offered at altars, the rustle of robes, the soft murmur of prayers, all act as feedback loops for divine influence. Fringe scholars propose that these narrative details may reflect early anthropological observation, humans seeking patterns and meaning in unpredictable events. Historians still argue whether Apollo's role as both healer and punisher mirrors an actual cultural understanding of divine justice or simply dramatizes the moral stakes of mythology. By the end of these episodes, a slow rhythm settles. You feel the warmth of the sun fading into evening, the scent of laurel leaves and earth wrapping around your imagination, and the gentle cadence of myth reminding you of the intricate balance between power and responsibility. Apollo, golden and radiant, embodies both protection and peril, teaching mortals through action, consequence, and careful observation. You sink further into your pillow or cushion, noticing how the layered sensory details, the wind, the faint hum of ritual, the warmth and cool of stone, meld with narrative cadence. The story lulls you onward, a gentle oscillation of caution and reassurance, guiding you through myth with quiet precision. You trudge along winding mountain paths now, the faint scent of thyme and sun-baked stone drifting in your imagination as Apollo's story turns toward his romantic entanglements with the nymph Daphne. Imagine the delicate tension of pursuit, golden hair glinting in sunlight, eyes fixed on the fleeting movement of a figure just beyond reach. Daphne's feet barely touch the ground, her cloak brushing branches and leaves, the faint rustle blending with the whisper of wind through the pines. Fringe scholars suggest that these myths may encode early ideas about consent and desire, while historians still argue whether the story is primarily a cautionary tale or a poetic dramatization of unattainable longing. You notice the sensory layers immediately, the subtle scent of crushed leaves, the warmth of sunlight on skin, the soft snap of twigs underfoot, and the faint murmur of distant streams. Apollo's pursuit is graceful yet insistent, a combination of skill, charm, and divine impulsiveness. Fringe interpretations suggest the story may also function allegorically, representing the pursuit of elusive beauty or the fleeting nature of desire. You can almost feel the tension coiling in your chest as the chase unfolds, each heartbeat synced to imagined footsteps, each inhalation carrying the scent of pine and faint earthiness. The chase is long and deliberate. You trudge alongside them, sensing the nymph's sharp awareness and the god's careful calculation. Apollo's movements are fluid, almost dancing, his golden hair a shimmer in the dappled sunlight. Daphne twists, ducks, and leaps over roots, each motion both reactive and expressive. Historians still debate whether the myth symbolizes the tension between nature and civilization, divine intervention and mortal autonomy, or whether it simply dramatizes unrequited love. Fringe sources often note the physicality of these stories, the emphasis on motion, rhythm, and spatial awareness, suggesting that myth was a subtle way of encoding embodied experience. Then comes the transformation. Daphne calls to her father, Punnius, the river god, and her form begins to change, skin turning to bark, hair to leaves, limbs elongating into branches. You feel the gentle, almost hypnotic tension as metamorphosis unfolds, the earthy scent deepening, the rustle of leaves harmonizing with the wind. Fringe scholars sometimes interpret this as symbolic of unattainable desire, or as a warning about divine overreach, while historians still argue whether it represents a ritualized understanding of nature or simply a poetic embellishment. You, curled into your pillow or bed, sense both wonder and calm, the transformation gentle yet inevitable, each detail pulling you deeper into the story's cadence. Apollo reaches the transformed nymph and touches the emerging laurel tree with a soft, reverent hand. You notice the sensory texture, bark under fingertips, faint aroma of fresh leaves, the warm glow of sun highlighting golden hair, now interwoven with green. From this moment forward, the laurel becomes sacred to him, a living symbol of pursuit, unattainable love, and subtle triumph. Historians still debate whether this myth reflects a cultural origin for laurel wreath rituals or poetic storytelling. Yet you feel the narrative's hypnotic rhythm smoothing over tension, a gentle, enduring lull that wraps the chase, transformation, and symbolism into a slow, mesmerizing cadence, perfect for coaxing your mind toward rest. You trudge through sunlit olive groves now, the air thick with crushed leaves and the faint tang of distant sea salt, as Apollo turns his attention to his artistic influence over mortals. Picture artisans shaping bronze, poets bending language to rhythm, and musicians plucking strings under the soft glow of sunset. Apollo moves among them with effortless grace, offering inspiration that is at once subtle and overwhelming, like the delicate brushstroke that transforms a sculpture or the single note that changes a melody. Fringe scholars suggest that these myths reflect early Greek ideas about genius and inspiration, while historians still argue whether they describe divine bestowal or metaphorical encouragement for human creativity. You notice the tactile richness, the scratch of chisel on bronze, the smooth slide of clay under fingers, the faint vibration of a lyre resonating through a courtyard. Apollo's presence seems almost tangible, golden hair catching sunbeams, warm breath blending with the air scented by herbs and baking bread, eyes glowing faintly as if lit by inner fire. Fringe interpretations sometimes claim that these stories encode early pedagogical practices, observation, apprenticeship, and imitation of excellence framed as divine intervention. You lean back slightly, feeling the slow rhythm of the artisan's work mirrored in your own breathing, a hypnotic sync with the narrative's cadence. Occasionally, Apollo demonstrates his guidance through playful challenge. A young musician plays a melody too hastily, and the god gently retunes strings with a knowing smile, leaving the apprentice both awed and bemused. You can almost hear the subtle twang of strings, the faint murmur of encouragement, and the distant laughter carried on the wind. Historians still argue whether these moments reflect early Greek methods of mentorship or are simply narrative flourishes meant to humanize the god. Fringe scholars also suggest that this playful correction reflects a deeper understanding of motivation, that inspiration without discipline yields beauty that is fleeting and incomplete. Apollo's influence extends beyond artistry to emotional resonance. You notice how a poet's words seem to blossom under his gaze, a sculptor's forms grow more harmonious, and a musician's tune reaches unexpected depths. Fringe interpretations suggest this is symbolic. Art as a means of aligning human perception with divine order, or even as a conduit for moral and aesthetic education. Historians still debate whether these tales were intended to explain the source of artistic skill or to glorify Apollo as the patron of culture. The scene itself is rich, sunlight filtering through olive branches, faint bird calls punctuating the gentle murmur of apprentices, and the soft earthy smell of crushed leaves underfoot, creating a sensory tapestry that mirrors the story's thematic depth. As the sun dips toward the horizon, painting gold and amber across the grove, you sense a slow, hypnotic rhythm settling. Apollo's guidance, whether literal or allegorical, leaves its mark, a quiet imprint of focus, patience, and subtle inspiration that hums beneath the surface of every artistic endeavor. You feel it too, a gentle resonance, a soft pull at your attention and imagination, matching the slow cadence of storytelling. The grove, the artisans, and the golden god together form a lullaby of creativity and order, guiding you into a calm, measured awareness that hums gently like the last notes of a lyre fading into twilight. You trudge along sun-bleached valleys now, the scent of dry grasses mingling with the faint tang of river water, as Apollo's story shifts toward his musical and prophetic contests with the god Pan. Imagine a scene alive with subtle tension. The air ripples with anticipation, reeds sway lightly in the breeze, and the distant babble of water sets a rhythmic undertone. Apollo strums his lyre, every note precise, shimmering like sunlight on calm water, while Pan blows into his aulos, wild and untamed. Fringe scholars suggest this story symbolizes the tension between order and chaos in art, while historians still argue whether the contest reflects historical cultural rivalries or narrative allegory. You notice the sensory details, the warm vibration of lyre strings under Apollo's fingers, the earthy, breathy sound of Pan's pipes, and the faint dust rising from the valley floor with each step. The contrast between Apollo's disciplined tones and Pan's improvisational flourishes is palpable, creating a hypnotic oscillation between tension and harmony. Fringe interpretations suggest that the myth encodes early Greek ideas of aesthetic duality, structure versus spontaneity, while historians still debate whether these myths were meant to instruct audiences in musical taste or simply entertain with dramatized rivalry. As the contest unfolds, the spectators, nymphs, satyrs, and villagers lean in, eyes wide, bodies poised to react to each note. You can feel the subtle vibrations in the air, hear the intricate layering of sound, and even sense the tiny movements of leaves stirred by resonating music. Apollo maintains calm, almost effortless mastery, while Pan's raw energy surges unpredictably. Fringe scholars note that such tales may reflect broader philosophical debates, the disciplined intellect versus untamed creativity, the balance of control and inspiration. You, tucked comfortably into your own space, can almost feel the rhythm of each note synchronizing with your own heartbeat, a gentle pull toward immersive calm. The story reaches a delicate climax. Apollo's music, harmonically perfect and meticulously timed, gradually overwhelms Pan's aulos, not through force but through disciplined resonance and subtle charm. The contrast is both thrilling and serene, the triumph less about dominance than about refinement and patience. Historians still argue whether this narrative reflects societal values, allegorical teaching, or poetic exaggeration, but the sensory and emotional impact remains vivid. You notice the faint rustle of leaves, the sun bouncing off smooth stones, and the quiet murmurs of an enthralled audience, all reinforcing the hypnotic cadence of myth in motion. Finally, Apollo is declared the winner, not through cruelty, but by demonstrating harmony and measured skill. Pan accepts the outcome with reluctant admiration, leaving behind lessons of balance, temperance, and the nuanced interplay between instinct and discipline. Fringe sources often highlight that this myth teaches subtle ethical and aesthetic principles, without overt didacticism. You, wrapped in the story's rhythm, feel the gentle settling of tension, the warmth of sun on your imagined skin, and the fading resonance of musical notes. The valley seems to exhale, and you sink deeper into the soothing, deliberate flow of narrative, ready for the calm unfolding of subsequent tales. You trudge along rocky cliffs now, the scent of salt and sun-baked stone in your imagination, as Apollo turns his attention to mortals' understanding of astronomy and the movement of the heavens. Picture the night sky stretching above, stars glittering faintly like scattered diamonds, the faint hum of nocturnal insects adding texture to the silence. Apollo, ever radiant, gestures with a golden hand, tracing patterns among constellations, the faint glow of the moon illuminating the ridges of his face. Fringe scholars suggest these myths may encode early Greek attempts to systematize celestial observation, while historians still argue whether the stories are literal reflections of astronomical study or poetic metaphors for order and harmony in the cosmos. You notice the sensory richness immediately. The cool brush of night air against your imagined skin, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, the gentle smell of crushed sage and wild herbs stirred by a whispering breeze. Apollo demonstrates movement patterns of planets and stars, explaining cycles of time, the waxing and waning of the moon, and the season's subtle rhythms. Fringe interpretations suggest that these stories may reflect ancient educational tools, blending observation with narrative to encode complex information in memorable, accessible ways. You, comfortably settled with your pillow or cushion, feel the gentle pulse of curiosity and comprehension, syncing with the slow rhythm of storytelling. The story highlights both instruction and divine presence. You see Apollo tracing paths across the sky with a faint golden glow, planets orbiting in imagined harmony, constellations rising and setting with precise rhythm. Fringe scholars sometimes note that the myths subtly reinforce moral and social order. As the heavens are structured, so too should human behavior aspire to balance and clarity. Historians still argue whether these celestial tales were practical guides, symbolic metaphors, or poetic entertainment, but their hypnotic cadence and vivid imagery remain compelling. You notice the soft rustle of wind through sparse cliffside vegetation and the faint metallic glint of Apollo's instruments reflecting starlight. Occasionally, the myth emphasizes human observation. Mortals attempt to chart the stars themselves, their fingers tracing lines along the night sky, scribbling symbols in sand or clay, while Apollo's gentle corrections refine their understanding. Fringe sources suggest these moments may represent early pedagogical approaches to astronomy, teaching careful observation and pattern recognition, while historians still debate whether they were literal practices or narrative dramatization. You can almost feel the warmth of sunlit stone cooling under the night air, the faint vibration of golden strings echoing across the cliffs, and the subtle pull of celestial patterns in your mind, drawing you deeper into calm attention and gentle curiosity. By the end of this nocturnal lesson, the stars seem to pulse with quiet order, and you feel a sense of rhythmic reassurance, the cosmos a lullaby of predictable cycles and gentle guidance. Apollo, radiant and precise, becomes both teacher and comforter, bridging mortal understanding with divine clarity. Fringe and historical debates linger, but you are safely immersed in the hypnotic cadence of narrative, sensory detail, and celestial wonder. The night air cools your imagined skin, the faint scent of herbs and stone settles around you, and the rhythm of the stars syncs with your own breathing, softly coaxing your mind toward rest as the story unfolds gently into its next chapter. You trudge along sun-drenched coastlines now, the scent of salt water and warmed sand filling your imagination, as Apollo's story turns toward his association with sailors, navigation, and the calming or stirring of storms. Picture ships bobbing gently in a sparkling harbor, their sails flapping softly in a breeze that carries a hint of seaweed and distant spices. Apollo walks along the shoreline, golden hair glinting in sunlight, hands outstretched as if orchestrating the wind, the waves, and the distant cries of gulls. Fringe scholars suggest that these myths reflect early Greek understanding of meteorology and sea currents, while historians still argue whether Apollo's role at sea is symbolic or tied to practical maritime guidance. You notice the sensory texture, warm grains of sand underfoot, the subtle spray of salt water against imagined skin, the faint creak of timbers as ships shift with the tide. Apollo gestures toward a rising storm on the horizon, and you sense the delicate tension. Sailors glance nervously, but the god's calm authority reassures them. Fringe interpretations propose that these tales encode early attempts to conceptualize cause and effect in nature, blending myth with observation. You, lying comfortably, feel a slow, hypnotic rhythm as the waves in your mind mirror the god's deliberate movements, each gesture flowing seamlessly into the next. The narrative highlights the balance between control and unpredictability, Apollo can soothe raging seas with subtle signals, yet he also demonstrates the consequences of ignoring natural laws or divine guidance. Historians still debate whether these stories reflect literal maritime practices, symbolic moral instruction, or simply narrative embellishment. You notice the sensory details, the warm sun glancing off golden sand, the cool touch of water on your toes, the distant echo of a lyre floating from the shoreline. The story's cadence is hypnotic, gentle, like waves lapping against a quiet harbor, lulling attention into calm observation. Occasionally, Apollo interacts directly with mortals, guiding a young captain through fog, steadying a ship caught in an unexpected current, or signaling favorable winds with subtle flicks of light and motion. Fringe scholars suggest these tales reinforce early Greek values of vigilance, respect for natural forces, and attentiveness to instruction. Historians still argue whether these accounts were used pedagogically for sailors or functioned primarily as mythic entertainment. You notice the sensory interplay of salt spray, the warmth of sunlight, the faint hum of wind through rigging, all reinforcing a rhythmic, almost hypnotic narrative pace. By the story's end, the harbor is calm again. Apollo's presence lingers, like a gentle exhalation over the waves, leaving sailors reassured and you enveloped in quiet wonder. His dual role as guide and disciplinarian embodies lessons of respect, skill, and attentiveness. Fringe and historical debates persist, but the hypnotic rhythm, the layered sensory details, and the gentle ebb and flow of narrative merge, coaxing your mind toward a slow, steady calm. The sun sets over the imagined horizon, painting waves with gold and amber, and you feel the soft pull of myth's cadence synchronizing with your own breathing, preparing you for the final chapter of this long, restful journey. You trudge along a quiet, moonlit grove now, the faint scent of night-blooming flowers and dewy earth curling into your imagination as Apollo's story reaches its culmination in his enduring legacy. Picture him standing beneath the silver glow of moonlight, golden hair catching the subtle luminescence, his presence serene yet commanding. He surveys temples, lyres, laurel groves, and star-mapped skies, all the domains he has shaped, guided, and inspired. Fringe scholars suggest that these myths may encode early Greek concepts of immortality through cultural influence, while historians still argue whether Apollo's overarching presence reflects divine narrative convenience or an embodiment of societal ideals. You notice the sensory richness immediately: soft rustling leaves, the faint hum of nocturnal insects, the cool brush of night air against your imagined skin. Apollo walks slowly, each step measured and deliberate, tracing lines of influence through mortal lives, artistry, music, and prophecy. Fringe interpretations suggest that these movements encode the subtle weaving of fate, culture, and personal growth. Historians still debate whether the myths of Apollo's omnipresence were intended as moral instruction, poetic embellishment, or symbolic celebration of human aspiration under divine inspiration. The story emphasizes continuity. You see young musicians practicing near laurel groves, the Pythia offering prophecies at Delphi, sailors gliding under calm skies, and students tracing star patterns. Apollo's influence threads through these moments like golden light, connecting discrete points into a coherent pattern. Fringe scholars propose that these interconnected stories reflect early Greek attempts to create a cohesive moral, cultural, and cosmic framework. You, nestled comfortably in your pillow or cushion, feel the rhythmic cadence of narrative pull you gently into rest, each vignette a subtle brushstroke of enduring order and inspiration. You sense the quiet interplay of time and legacy. Mortal observers of the myths marvel at his perfection and versatility, yet even gods are not immune to narrative tension, moments of humor, desire, and frustration. Historians still argue whether this layering of traits was meant to humanize the divine or simply enhance narrative appeal. You notice the gentle textures of the night, dew-laden leaves brushing fingertips, the distant glimmer of a candle in a temple, the faint scent of incense carried on a soft breeze. These details, subtle and continuous, create a slow, hypnotic lull that entwines sensory awareness with the story's moral and aesthetic threads. By the end of this imagined journey, you feel the calming weight of completion. Apollo, radiant and multifaceted, embodies artistry, prophecy, love, discipline, and guidance. Fringe and historical debates swirl gently at the edges, but the hypnotic cadence, layered sensory details, and subtle moral undercurrents settle your mind. The moon dips lower, a final breeze stirs the night, and the entire world of myth seems to exhale with you. Each domain, each lesson, each carefully drawn detail of the gods' influence fades softly into memory, leaving your imagination poised between wakefulness and rest, a gentle, golden thread of myth wrapping around the slow rhythm of your own breathing.